So there's a challenge ahead of them. Now, I want to bring in now Darrel Blake, who teaches Black British history and is a sort of social activist as well. Thank you very much for joining me. Tell me a little bit about Sir Robert Geffrye and why his legacy here in the sort of Hoxton area is so problematic.
Well, first of all, we have to realise that this man profited of one of the most traumatic experiences in human history. Yeah, he did pump a lot into this community, into the Hoxton area, but he was mainly behind the East India Company and the Royal African Company. And when you look at the Royal African Company, this was like the powerhouse behind the Transatlantic Slave Trade. I mean, they trafficked more Africans than any other organisation in the entire history of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Might I add to that is King Charles II and King James II and the 7th of Scotland were literally behind funding and supporting people like Robert Geffrye into the transatlantic slave trade. And what we don't realise is that this is a recent sort of like phenomenon, understanding who this man is. Had we known about this man before, had we known about this man through the national curriculum, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So I think the highlight behind Robert Geffrye is about him being glorified. As you enter into the museum, is it to say, hi, we're honouring him, please come in and welcome yourself to this building which was financed by Geffery, which is entirely wrong in my opinion.
And of course, this is a very, very difficult issue, whether we have statues up, whether they should be pulled down or not. I mean, we were speaking before we sort of came on air and we were sort of saying, you've sort of changed your tune on this. You know, initially you were very keen for them all to be sort of pulled down. Now you feel slightly different about it. Tell me why you've slightly changed your opinion on it.
Okay, so through my research and when I find out about, you know, especially London anyway, how they've honoured and glorified people who participate in the transatlantic slave trade, my inner feeling and my inner sort of approach to things was remove any sort of representation or residue of the transatlantic slave trade. But then, through working with young people and working with children, I realised that me doing so, or us doing so, as a nation, if we remove the statues, then it's sort of been wiped out. And then Britain can sort of move on and be like, hey, it didn't happen because where's the evidence? So as much as a part of me, I'm 50% removed, but the other part is we should keep some statues or some monuments and, you know, landmarks, but have the real information. And the key thing is about what sort of context are you going to be put in there? Because we know throughout history that, you know, the truth is not always told. And a lot of the stories that we hear about are pretty much whitewashed. So if they do remove this statue and bring it to another part of the building or another part of the site, what are they actually going to say? So I think they need to work with local communities, local organisations, people who are, you know, advocates for telling black history or African history essentially, and make sure that the right stories are being told.
Now, what you sort of proposed there about making sure that it's not a question of pulling anything down, it's a question of putting it in a less prominent position and giving some sort of contextualisation and some history. Yeah. I think sort of most people sort of watching would say, well, I think that seems quite sensible. I suppose the concern that some people will have is that what we saw in Bristol last year with the Edward Colston statue being sort of pulled down and sort of thrown in the water, I think some people were kind of shocked by aspects of that. Now, it is important to stress that didn't come out of the blue. There was a huge amount of work that was done in Bristol with many people voicing opposition to it. So it may have appeared out of the blue to many people, but that's not what happened. However, I think there is something people find quite aggressive about statues being sort of pulled down. Can you understand perhaps people's concerns, I guess, around statues being removed or not, particularly given what we saw last summer?
Yeah, I can understand people's rage, and that's because people who were raged, they love English history. And they feel like if a part of their history is being erased, then a part of themselves is being erased. But what they want to do is keep the statues up and say, you know, it's a part of history, it didn't happen in our time, let's move on. But they don't really understand that those people who participated in such, you know, atrocious behaviours affected lives of many people across the African diaspora. And seeing statues and monuments of these individuals can actually trigger certain feelings amongst certain people. So pulling down statues was a reaction to something that happened last year, which is the death of George Floyd. And it's a reactional anger to something, but, you know, it's a standard feeling. And I think it was, how we should actually look at that is, it was a global feeling and harmony feeling of, do you know what, the action needs to happen. And with something like pulling down a statue, it's a statue. It's not. We're not removing an individual from a position of power. It's not human. It's an actual thing. And what that actually does is bring out another conversation, which is, okay, how can we address history in the right place and in the right time?
And thinking about conversations, Darrel runs walking tours around London looking at Black British history. Since last summer, how much more sort of interest have you seen, and how much more discussion are we all seeing, difficult discussions, about particularly London's legacy when it comes to the slave trade?
I've seen a lot of attention, but it took for a black man to die in order for people to be like, hi. So there's sort of like a guilt feeling. I do love the attention because then I can have conversations with people. But it took for someone to die, or, you know, for a video to be out of a man having a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds for people to be like, oh, I feel guilty and I feel sad. And I feel like part of it is to do with, actually, I want to learn more. But I do feel like some of the attention is performative, you know, just tick boxing to say that, hey, do you know what? Let's have this conversation. But it's for the moment, just to seem like I'm doing something to kind of support organisation or support Black Lives Matter. So I guess we should capitalise off the attention at the moment, but more in-depth conversations to happen in schools, in the work environment, and with the NHS as well.
Darrel, thank you so much for your expertise this morning. We're here this morning because of the discussion that's taking place about the statue here, but we're actually going to be moving to Battersea now and looking at a housing complex that's got a name that a lot of people find very difficult because of its connotations with the slave trade, and that's Plantation Wharf. So we're going to be heading there now as we sort of have a bit of a sort of tour looking at sort of London's history that has been very much in the sort of news over the last week or so in many different ways, because of course these are difficult conversations that have been happening, particularly because of last summer, as very much sort of London is trying to reconcile with a very difficult past for many people.
Yeah, indeed. Alice, really good to see you this morning. Thank you for that.
This explains the wharf in this area, and just explain to me why you find it problematic.
Well, first and foremost, it's called Plantation Wharf, and again, when you think of plantations, you think about the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and having this sign up with the area called Plantation Wharf, essentially, it just goes to show it's distasteful and it's insensitive. I mean, you have a section that says molasses roll. Now, we're thinking about molasses, people think about rum. But there's two processes. So you have the growing of what you have is sugarcane, which then goes into sugarcane and sugarcane granules. And within that process, thousands and thousands and thousands of people have to cultivate this crop here. And within that process, under the idea of putting African lives below European lives, people have died, thousands of people have been separated in terms of their families, and to have a reminder of a plantation wharf having molasses roll just goes to show that they don't actually take the situation serious. And underneath that same breath, I would say, to put it into context in terms of the plantation, according to the 2011 census, there were 1.1 million black people living in London. On the slave records to this date, 1.2 million Africans were trafficked all the way to Jamaica alone. 388,000 were taken to the United States. So when you have the Trade Tower, okay, and you have Cotton Row, it just goes to show that the story or the reality of what Britain sees the transatlantic slave trade is something of a minute part of history, and it's something that we can just mock and not actually take it to the level of it's just as bad as the Holocaust.
Now, of course, the developers will say that they are trying to embrace the history of this area and aren't trying to ignore the history at all. Is it possible for us to have street names, housing development names or monuments that recognise UK's history with the transatlantic slave trade and do it in a way that is sensitive? Or will there always be a name that is seen to be offensive because of the connotations?
100%. It is offensive because while we're giving names to trauma, what we should be doing is giving names to those who survived. We should be giving names to those who fought back, not those who contributed to Britain's wealth. And that's the problem. That's the cognitive dissonance. There's a guy named a brilliant man named Professor Kehinde Andrews, and he has premiered this term called white psychosis or psychosis of whiteness. And what that means is that the idea of whiteness, not white people, the idea of whiteness in itself is a political form of putting themselves first or putting them in the center of the universe. And within that context, you have people under the umbrella of whiteness that they can remove themselves from any part of history where they've actually disrespected or disregarded a human life. And having something like this, or having street names named after people who participated in the transatlantic slave trade, is horrible. And to think that there's a way around it just goes to show about the cognitive dissonance of some people in society who think it's okay to even have some buildings, monuments, and street names up representing that part of history.
Now, of course, there may be some people who feel we've obviously had lots of discussion in the last year or so about street names and about monuments, but there may be people who feel that street names is something that is not the heart of where racial inequality is at in this country. And then obviously, I mean, we were earlier at a statue in the east of London that, I mean, I've never noticed it before. There may be people who feel, well, actually, if we want to really tackle racial injustice, is changing a few street names and housing complex names, is that really the heart of the issue? What would you say to that?
That's just a small fraction. There needs to be more conversation, but it starts with education. As educating myself, I realised so much through the national curriculum the lack of truth and understanding about British history. And, you know, over 200 countries in the world, you know, Britain hasn't colonised 20 of them. So through that alone just goes to show that why are we not having these conversations with young people? Again, with the idea of Plantation Wharf, I mean, Britain being a powerful establishment within the transatlantic slave trade came under Queen Elizabeth I. She's highlighted as this great monarch to some people, fair enough, but under her bracket you had people like John Hawking and you had Francis Drake, who worked underneath her on the idea of putting England first, and they pioneered what we know as the transatlantic slave trade in the mid-1500s. So it starts with education, small bits of changing street names, but it's about having the honest conversation. And when I mean honest, it's about telling the truth in a 360 scale.
And would you like to see, so for example, you mentioned earlier there that there's been obviously some very sort of neglected people in history, people of colour that we perhaps don't give monuments to and we haven't given street names to. Do you think if people are watching this and thinking, well, these housing developers, museums, anyone who has these very difficult monuments, what do we do about it the way forward? Is, from what you were saying earlier there, that one way forward is to embrace people of colour who have been neglected from history and make sure that we give them more prominence in terms of our public locations. I mean, of course, that's something Sadiq Khan very much wants to do with this scheme that he's been rolling out.
Yeah, the thing about it is it's something that needs to happen, but it's about who you're having in these rooms. So, and who you're selecting, because, for example, Black History Month was started here in the 1980s, in the same decade that this building complex, ironically, began its plans and was built. And it's about who are we celebrating in terms of the Black stories, because there's loads of names. You know, thinking about the Caribbean alone, I can name like 20 people off the top of my head who we should celebrate here. But then we've got to think about those in the West African side of the continent who we should celebrate as well. So we do need to celebrate Black people's achievements and people who stood up. But it will be a clash between celebrating the enslaver and celebrating the enslaved, and the two can't work together.
Well, Darrel, thank you very much for joining me today. We've been to two different locations in London. We've been to the Museum of the Home in East London. We've come down here to Plantation Wharf at Battersea, because both areas are ones where there's been controversy over the name and over the statue recently. And I don't think this conversation is going anywhere anytime soon. Obviously, it was very much reignited last summer, but this is a conversation that is very much ongoing as many people look around London, look at the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and ask some very difficult questions about London's role within it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alice. That's our London reporter, Alice Porter.